thank you all for staying until 5 o'clock or 5:30 or later on a Saturday afternoon. I'm an environmental scientist. We use a lot of slides. Maybe that's a crutch to help us figure out what we're going to say. But there will even be some graphs in there. I think we haven't seen too many of those today. But I'm going to talk about something a little bit different, something we haven't talked very much about today, and that is the environment and specifically the data that are used to look at the environment and to look at environmental changes. And I'm going to talk about an initiative in China called DBAR, which is the Digital Belt and Road. And I think it came up in a talk earlier today of the digital Silk Road. And DBAR is a component of what you might imagine the digital Silk Road to be. DBAR is the component that uses big Earth data to look at environmental change. We've seen this before. This is the Belt and Road region, and it's massive. Okay, and it encompasses effectively all of the biomes, almost all of the biomes that we have on the Earth as a whole, and many of the ecosystem types that we have on the Earth as a whole. So we're talking about a highly diverse region in terms of the environment, in terms of vegetation, in terms of hydrology, in terms of geology. So it is very diverse from an environmental perspective. So what DBAR is it's effectively a big Earth data platform that is it's supposed to support sustainable development. So that it's supposed to support sustainable development of Belt and Road initiatives. I've been working with DBAR for a few years. I don't know how effective that link is between DBAR and Belt and Road initiatives, but the data collection effort is there, and it's a fairly substantial effort. So the Big Earth Data Platform will include things like ocean-based observations, ground-based observations, but largely satellite-based observations, remotely sensed observations of the Earth's surface. And the DBAR has 8 working groups, and those are agriculture, disaster, environment, heritage, urban and infrastructure, water, coastal and marine systems, and high mountain and Arctic systems. And the goal is for these working groups to collect data, develop data, and data products that will support indicators of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. There is a science plan, and the objectives of the DBAR science plan are to address knowledge gaps in Earth system processes, that constrain the attainment of sustainable development in Belt and Road countries, to promote science and decision support services, to extract the information from a very, very large volume of Big Earth data, to extract the useful information from that, and to enhance capacity building and technology transfer across the different Belt and Road nations. The DBAR is a 10-year effort that began in 2016. We've just completed the planning phase of DBAR, and now we're moving into more of an implementation phase. And the beginning of that implementation phase will largely be collection of Big Earth data sets, development of data products. Professor Guo Huadong is the director of DBAR from the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And recently, in this year, last year, he published a commentary in the journal Nature, Steps to the Digital Silk Road, sharing big data from satellite imagery and other Earth observations across Asia, Middle East, and East Africa is key to sustainability. And there are many things that we can do and we can observe with satellite remote sensing data. These are the examples that appeared in that Nature paper. We can observe the urban development from space in Beijing. We could look at land, coastal, ecological interactions, in this case in Iran. We can track and map wildfires, which occur across a large part of the Belt and Road region. and we can look at development encroaching on cultural and heritage sites. China has a very substantive and sophisticated satellite program, particularly Earth-observing satellites. The Gaofen series of 1 to 6 satellites, Earth observation satellites, those were launched from 2013 to 2018. 2 of those, I believe, 5 and 6, were just launched last summer. Part of the China High Resolution Earth Observation System program, with a variety of sensors on these satellites, looking at multispectral imaging, optical remote sensing, radar, with the intention to provide high temporal, high spatial, and high spectral resolution data for Earth observations. 2 hyperspectral satellites were launched on Jilin-1 this past January. That's with a contract between the Chinese Academy of Sciences and a private company. And these hyperspectral satellites have a resolution of 5 meters, and they collect data across 26 spectral bands. And that's actually quite a bit more than your typical multispectral satellite would have. So these satellites they're part of a plan to place 60 satellites by 2020 and a constellation of 138 satellites in low Earth orbit by 2030 for global coverage, all day, all weather, full spectrum, or as close as they can get. So my role in this is I am on the Environmental Change Working Group. I'm a co-chair of the Environmental Change Working Group. The other co-chairs are Li Xinwu from the Institute of Remote Sensing and Digital Earth, and Jia Genswo from the Institute of Atmospheric Physics, both at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and that is the photograph from our first working group meeting, which occurred a few years ago in Beijing. So now I'm going to talk mostly about the Environmental Change Working Group of DBAR. And our focus is on 3 UN Sustainable Development goals. They are clean water, climate action, and life on land. And in order to inform those 3 Sustainable Development goals, we look at things like vegetation and vegetation dynamics. We look at carbon cycling. We look at water in its liquid and frozen forms. And we look at how climate and human activity are influencing these factors that ultimately go into the indicators of sustainable development. The objectives of our working group: establish a science and policy network and Big Earth data platform to improve environmental monitoring in the Belt and Road regions. Utilize this Big Earth data platform to conduct observations, simulations of climate change impacts on land surface processes across a variety of scales, and then use Big Earth data evaluation methods to provide policy support for sustainable development goals in Belt and Road. So the next set of slides are, some of these are just general, and some of these are working group initiatives. Climate change is a major factor in the Belt and Road region. There is pronounced warming in much of the Belt and Road region, particularly in the northern part of the region and largely during the winter and spring months. You'll see, if you look at the map on the left, the red areas are the warming, the blue are the cooling for the different seasons. And so there is some cooling going on in the central part of the Belt and Road region. Precipitation is likely, changes in precipitation are likely to be just as important as changes in temperature. We see increased fall, winter, and spring precipitation, largely at the mid-latitudes of Belt and Road, and then strong drying in the west, and drying in other areas throughout Belt and Road. This is an environmental working group project looking at summer heat waves in the Belt and Road region. One thing I should point out, I want to point out, is that the Chinese Academy of Sciences has a massive effort right now called CAS Earth. And DBAR, Digital Belt and Road, is actually a sub-project within Cass Earth. So Cass Earth is much larger than just the DBAR project. Another project of the Environmental Change Working Group is Drought Risk. This is a drought risk assessment in cultivated areas of Central Asia. These are remotely sensed indices of vegetation health. And what they observe is that an index of vegetation health has decreased in this area since 2000. A really important variable that maybe gets overlooked sometimes is snow cover. Okay, the extent and the duration of snow cover and the amount of water that is in snow. Snow cover across large extents of land is a northern hemisphere phenomenon. And there's snow cover across most of Belt and Road. And it's the variable that's probably changing faster than any other environmental variable out there, maybe with the exception of Arctic Ocean sea ice. Both of those are decreasing at dramatic rate. Spring snow cover in the northern hemisphere, particularly in the Eurasian part of the northern hemisphere, is decreasing 10 to 15% per year. And snow has a major impact on water resources throughout the region and also on surface energy balance, okay, the exchange of radiation between the atmosphere and the land and the sun and the land. Rangeland and dryland degradation is also a big issue throughout Belt and Road. You don't need to remove a lot of vegetation by grazing in order to increase dust fluxes and erosion exponentially. Okay, you get rid of a little bit of the vegetation and the erosion increases dramatically. And a lot of this is due to grazing or overgrazing in some of these lands. Vegetation changes are happening across Belt and Road. This is an example of high latitude vegetation changes. We're seeing tall shrubs replace short-statured tundra vegetation over large areas of Russia, up to 25% increases in shrub cover where the vegetation used to be very short, and these shrubs are several meters. It's a big change in productivity, in carbon cycling, in energy balance. To the right, interestingly, these are spy satellite images of over the former Soviet Union. Well, the top one is a spy satellite image from 1966, coupled with a commercial satellite image from 2009. This is another Cass Earth project. It's vegetation change at the 3 poles, which are considered to be the Arctic, the Antarctic, and the Tibetan Plateau as the 3rd pole. The Antarctic, I don't think, is part of the DBAR region, part of the Belt and Road yet. Maybe it will be at some point. The Arctic definitely is. We've heard mention of the ice silk road, and the opening of shipping routes in the northern and northeastern passage. And these 3 areas, or the Arctic and Tibetan Plateau in particular, are changing pretty dramatically. I have a few slides on the Tibetan Plateau because it's an area that I'm interested in to some degree. It's the largest and highest elevation plateau in the world, 2.5 million square kilometers of area, averaging 4,000 meters above sea level. We refer to it as the 3rd pole, in addition to the Arctic and the Antarctic. The next slide is a map of permafrost, but the Tibetan Plateau is the only major region on Earth with permanently frozen ground other than the Arctic and the Antarctic. It's called the Asian Water Tower. The major rivers in Asia originate on the Tibetan Plateau with an influence of up to 40% of the global population, which is pretty amazing. It is an area of largely of pastoralism, animal husbandry. They're the dominant forms of subsistence in the region, and the vegetation is alpine steppes, meadows, and shrublands. Yet there are some deciduous and evergreen forests on parts of the plateau. This is a map of permafrost, circumarctic map of permafrost, and you can see that that a large part of Belt and Road is underlain by permafrost. Permafrost is permanently frozen ground. The geological definition is ground that's less than 0 degrees for more than 2 years. And so if you look, there's a large part of the northeastern Belt and Road region that is underlain by permafrost. But in addition, we have the Tibetan Plateau. That is a permafrost region. Permafrost is it's an important topic for many environmental scientists because it stores carbon. It stores dead organic matter. And a big question in environmental sciences is the thawing of permafrost and the release of carbon dioxide and methane from permafrost back to the atmosphere, accelerating climate change and warming. I mentioned this before, but the Tibetan Plateau is the headwaters of major rivers in Asia, with providing water resource for hundreds of millions to billions of people in a dozen nations. So it's hugely important for water resources. Again, vegetation, alpine and subalpine meadows and grasslands, and provides rangeland for grazing animals. And it's warming, okay? The Tibetan Plateau, both summer and winter warming in the Tibetan Plateau is projected to be 3 degrees Celsius over the next century. The vegetation is increasing, it's greening, okay? The vegetation is becoming more robust with warmer temperatures, but a big question is what's going to happen to the permafrost in the Tibetan Plateau. Moving on from that, fire regimes are really important in Belt and Road. We can use satellites to monitor fires. The areas in the Belt and Road, some areas in the Belt and Road have some of the highest fire frequencies on the globe. But in general, a lot of the region does burn at some frequency, and the fire regimes are likely changing, okay, because climate is changing and climate is affecting vegetation, which is the fuel load for fires. So this can potentially have large impacts on carbon dioxide going back to the atmosphere. This is a working group project on smog and air pollution in India. The research was investigating the smog that developed in November of 2017 in northwestern India, and was a pretty serious health emergency there. Another environmental working group project is looking at the effects of civil war on agricultural production. This is an example from Syria showing that areas of many crops, including cotton and wheat, were reduced by as much as 2/3 due to the civil war there. And finally, just mention a few things about the plan for our working group, the Environmental Change Working Group, for 2019. We plan to produce a special report on environmental change that target those 3 sustainable development goals: clean water, climate action, and life on land, and to develop the data indicators that we're going to use to support sustainable development. And another focus of this working group was Central Asia, because it's an important part of the region, and there was a lack of activity, at least from our working group, a lack of activity in Central Asia and Kazakhstan. So the idea was to try to develop an international collaboration of excellence in Kazakhstan. So just to summarize, these are some of the things that we're trying to do and we're trying to think about from an environmental perspective in Belt and Road. We're trying to look at regional to continental scale issues, not just current and future remote sensing platforms, but also historical. Our satellite capabilities, they can go back to the 60s, and so we use information, historical, current, and future remote sensing platforms and sensors. And these are an array of environmental variables that we wish to look at: climate change, vegetation dynamics, biodiversity, land use cover, protection of soils, fire dynamics, air pollution and human health, hydrology, which includes snow cover extent, energy balances between the land and the atmosphere. Carbon cycling is obviously very important. We're from a CO2 and methane perspective, carbon storage, and then the cycling of other elements like nitrogen and phosphorus. All of these components clearly have very strong interactions with one another. The last thing that I wanted to say is that DBAR just recently launched a big Earth data sharing platform. The quotes are around the sharing. I don't know how available these data are going to be to people outside of the DBAR program. I know I have a username and a password, but I haven't tried to log in recently. But the objective is there. So there is a portal. There's a data sharing portal, and the goal over the next number of years is to populate this with big Earth data sets that will hopefully provide the information to inform sustainable development in Belt and Road on Belt and Road projects. And I think that's all that I had to say. Thanks.
All right, we have time for a few questions for both of our speakers. Are there questions for either or both of these guys? Good thing they have two New Yorkers at the end. They can talk really fast.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Boss.
Thank you. Thanks for the wonderful talk and for every talk today, too. I have a rather brief question for Eric, which is terrific to listen to the history of Southeast Asia in relation to China. As the traditional narrative about the collapse of the historical Silk Road was after the Mongol Empire, when it was taken over by the efficiency of transportation goods by way of ships. But as you pointed out, it was already quite relevant in the Song Dynasty, or even earlier when we look at the Beiditong shipwreck. So I wonder if you could comment on that and whether we should revise our narrative.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and I don't know the answer off the top of my head, but I think the one thing that we can almost certainly be sure of at almost any point in historical time, I think this would carry over really just a very, very long time span, would be that it's just simply more efficient to move things by sea than it is by land. So the particular conjunction of the Mongol conquest, right, between Hungary and Korea allows for this highway to move across the Eurasian steppe and the grasslands that we just saw. It makes for a kind of a particular moment, right? Brodel would call it a conjuncture, that travel could actually move with one power in charge of everything. But then when that Mongol interregnum is over, it only lasts just about 100 years, it becomes splintered into all these various khanates and eventually the gunpowder empires of the Mughals, the Safavids, the Ottomans. It just becomes much, much harder. But anytime you're transporting things over a long distance, you have to be able to kind of do that in a way that is going to make sense economically. And to do it with goats and mules and horses, they have to be able to eat grass the entire way. People who are moving slowly and a much slower distance across the grasslands need to be able to eat too. So I think the ships from a very early time became a kind of a better way to do it. But at the same time, the knowledge of the oceans was not very sophisticated. So that kind of came about over time, and there's kind of good ways of looking at that too. So I tried to talk about some of the Wu-Pei charts, portolans, rudders, these kinds of knowledge, whether European or Chinese. There were also Southeast Asian indigenous traditions, as well as the Taos of Arabia, to kind of learn how to make blue water voyages, to move away from the coast. And once people were able to do that, I think there was no going back.
Other questions? Yes.
I'd like to ask about the political side of the data, and particularly So data, it seems, it's not neutral, and because in the data science, or a lot of research has been kind of reporting about how data can be used and manipulated for a certain purpose. And I kind of wonder in this the digital Belt and Road, the data ownership and data sharing, and particularly for Chinese people or researchers to curate data, and who is actually contribute to those data? Is that top-down approach, or is it very bottom-up that require different countries to voluntarily submit data to the?
So from what I can see so far, it is the data contribution is largely a bottom-up. Okay, we're seeing partnerships between scientists in China and scientists from other Belt and Road nations. My working group is composed of scientists, maybe a dozen countries, and the data are coming from them. Okay, so the data are coming bottom up from the scientists. Now, what I can answer is the use of those data. Okay, so yes, I think that the data platform will be populated in part, I think, in part bottom up. But then what I can't speak to at this point is the accessibility of the data, or how those data are managed or used.
Let me ask a quick follow-up on that question, because it's something that I was wondering. It seems as though, I mean, we've heard a lot over the course of the day about Belt and Road, sort of somewhere in this space of active top-down program to vision to overarching banner. But it is this concerted set of activities. On the other hand, it sounds, from what you said, and tell me if I've got this right, that simultaneously with the physical Belt and Road, there is this observational, or digital as you called it, Belt and Road, which is going to be monitoring all of the locations where Belt and Road activities occur. And is this something new? You're talking about actually monitoring the effects of human activities deliberately. Is this new? Is this happening?
Well, I think that it's a great question, and I don't know how deliberate it is, and I also don't know how well the coordination is between Belt and Road projects and the digital Belt and Road. From the perspective that I've seen, I don't think there is a lot of coordination at this point. Maybe there will be more coordination as those data sets become more available. But honestly, right now I don't see a lot of coordination between DBAR and Belt and Road. The data that are coming in from the different working groups are not necessarily specifically focused on Belt and Road projects.
Okay, there was one question in the back. Yeah.
I had a sort of similar concern.
Can you wait for the mic? It's harder from the back to be loud.
Hello? Okay. I'm also interested in the data sharing aspect, but in learning, I mean, you talked about a system of hundreds of satellites observing all corners of the world, which is a massive project and a rich load of data. But I'm wondering if there are competing groups. Are there European or EU or other based groups? And especially my concern is the Trump administration suppressing data or somehow hindering the ability of U.S. scientists to access data with respect to climate change?
So many countries are putting up Earth observing satellites, right? We have the U.S. has a huge program. The European Union has a huge program. Japan has a program. Many countries have Earth observing satellite programs. The data from Chinese satellites have typically not been available outside of China, and many of the data from other nations have been available to other nations that want to use those data. I may have forgotten where am I? Help me. Where am I going with this? Did that answer your question, or? So for the work that I do here, the research that I do at UVA, I do not use Chinese satellites. I use largely U.S. and European Space Agency satellites. Oh, right. As far as suppressing data, I can't. I don't know. I can't answer that. I don't. I haven't. What? I think you'd have to kill me if I answered it. As far as suppressing data, I don't see. I've not seen any evidence of any data being suppressed. You're talking about data from satellite, these satellite observations, right? Yeah, any sorts of data. I mean, who knows? I don't know how. I don't know how well how good our carbon emissions our reporting has been, but no, yeah.
Well, what we know from a historical sense, how we showed the corona data from 1966, what we know is that the military satellites observing Earth are always about 5 to 10 years ahead of the civilian satellites. And we have to assume that that's still true, but it's not testable because we won't know until those data are declassified 30 years later.
Right. So those missions were in the 60s and the 70s, and Clinton declassified those with a large number of the images becoming available in 1995, and then the remainder in 2000, I think.
I have a question about the Tibetan Plateau and water that I've always wanted to ask, and you're the perfect person.
I may not be.
Well, we'll see. You mentioned that the headwaters of many of Asia's rivers are in Tibet, but I've always wondered what percentage of the ultimate mouth of the river water is actually from Tibet. You know,
What percent?
well, you know, where the headwaters are. I know that, say, the Mekong, the Langtang, coming into Southeast Asia. During the rainy season, it picks up a tremendous amount of water from Laos and whatever. So I'm just wondering where the origins are is not necessarily where the water's coming from. The water's coming from tributaries. It's coming from downstream. It's coming further downstream from the plateau.
That's true. I'm sorry. I don't think I have a good that I know the answer to the question. How you want what fraction of the water comes from the headwaters? Comes from the Tibetan Plateau as opposed to tributaries.
Plateau, yeah.
I mean, I could get. I'm a guess is that it's a pretty substantive fraction of that, but I don't know. I don't really know the answer to that.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, I believe now, rather than take yet another coffee break, although more coffee is always good, we will move on to the closing session. And Dorothy, do you want to introduce the closing session speaker?
Okay. Two of my very senior colleagues, they're going to have duet dialogues as conclusion to our wonderful conference. Professor Krishan Kumar, he's university professor and also William Keenan professor in sociology. Shichao Li is an architect and architecture historian. He's the Whedon Professor of Asian Architecture in the Architecture School. Please. Would you like to sit or stand? So they have a
microphone each. Is that switched on? It is, yes, it sounds.
There's also this, okay.
Right, okay. Well, thank you. I think I'm amazed that there's still people in the audience, and either you're held hostage by Dorothy Wong, or you're truly interested in the BRI project, and I'm sure you're all the latter. And I just, as the day went on and the possibility of summarizing or concluding this kind of whole day's discussions will be, it's really kind of diminishing. And I think it's really finally diminished with our two final presentations in terms of history and geography. The kind of, kind of reflecting on the broad geopolitical shifts that Bradley was discussing at the beginning. So I think maybe what we thought that we will leave the dialogue at the end as the main part of this this kind of concluding session. But before we do that, we each would like to contribute one additional point. So just in case we haven't had enough to discuss during the whole day, I think the point that I would like to begin with is something that Qingquan Li started to discuss, which is really about the nature of capital. That she, that's really great work that you went and documented that. But then I'm going to kind of go ahead against your advice on not going into theory. You said it's time to go to the ground and do the groundwork, and okay. I thought that was really great, and I really would like to kind of take that point and maybe push it on a little bit to really think about the work that's been doing and I've been interested in by a couple of sociologist friends of mine, Scott Lash and Michael Keith, who wrote a book a couple of years ago called China Constructing Capitalism, which made an interesting point that the capitalist, the kind of capitalism you find in China is quite different from the classic model that we use even today to describe global capitalism, which is based on this Bavarian model, which is really kind of focused on an economic purpose, predetermined, combined with an economic action aimed at producing a predetermined economic outcome. So that really, of course, there's a whole range of other things that Weber discussed, but that kind of was at the heart of this kind of value production in the system that we have. And what they are arguing in this book is that it's completely different in China in the sense that there is not so much an economic action, but an economic activities, and that really set it apart from the classic model in the sense that it is really moving. It's different from not having any goals or predetermined plan, but it's also different from having a very exact, specific goals. So it's really kind of moving roughly towards a direction which is then can be adjusted through the activities. And often when you go to a business meeting, it's also about dinner, it's also about guanxi, it's also about, family and so on and so forth. It's quite complex. So that in a way is sort of reflected in how Chinese companies operated perhaps in a different way. There is a difference. And that difference, I thought it would be interesting to introduce another contributor to the discussion on the culture side, and the French philosopher and sinologist François Julien, who actually thought about that particular kind of model of capitalism in so many other different aspects of culture. I think the typical kind of text that they use to discuss this is, of course, the Art of War by Sun Tzu. In the idea that the outcome of a war is not necessarily to destroy your enemy. The best kind of art of war is not to fight this war. So it is really not so much kind of going directly to the results, but more like kind of going around it. Like in another book called Detour and Axis, he kind of just started to compare the Chinese mind against the Greek mind in strategizing. So this is, putting all this together and thinking about the kind of the Chinese different kind of capitalism, if that kind of exists, going global, going overseas, and doing things differently is probably something that we should also consider. I think not all capital is the same. And this is really something certainly worth reflecting in this rather complex kind of geopolitical shifts that we're facing today. With that, I want to pass to Christian.
Well, it's a nice way of giving me an opportunity to introduce another kind of concept, which we've actually been. Is this working? Yeah. We've been talking about it quite a bit in various ways today, and that is the concept of empire or imperialism or colonialism, which has come up so many times. Just as Charles just said that there are varieties of capitalism, and there might be a form of Chinese capitalism that looks different from the classic Western form of capitalism. I think we should also think about empire as being a variable form, and I think it helps us to put BRI into a certain kind of context. Let me just remind you of some of the terms that some of our speakers used during the day, which all referred to some aspect of empire. Brantley Womack talked about colonial legacies in Southeastern Asia. Harry Harding referred to the idea of China constructing a new middle kingdom, either in Asia or in the world. John Echeverry-Gent referred to the Indian view that China was setting up a kind of new East India Company in Pakistan. He also talked about creditor imperialism. All these terms refer to the idea that BRI has some relationship to empire, but we're not quite clear exactly what kind of relationship. Now, Qin Li said we should not use the concept of colonialism. She preferred to talk about capital and capitalism. But I think what I would say to her is that just as capitalism comes in various forms, so does empire. And maybe if we think of the variety of forms, it might not be quite so improper to think about BRI in the context of empire. So I want to suggest two ways, perhaps, in which that might be true. The first way might be BRI as a response to European imperialism. And here I'm thinking particularly of the way that Brantley talked about it this morning, that what China was saying, or could be saying, to its neighbors in Southeast Asia, particularly in the region, was that it was breaking the old connections between the colonies of Southeast Asia and the metropolises of the West. So the French had their empire in Indochina, the British had practically all the rest, and obviously they set things up in such a way that relationships went from the region to their capitals in London and Paris and elsewhere. What Brantley was suggesting, I think, was that the Chinese were saying, look, you need to make connections among yourselves. We're going to help you to break those old colonial connections and establish your own that were more appropriate to you. So in that sense, it's aiding the effort to throw off the legacies of European imperialism. The other way, I think, that we might see BRI as a response to European imperialism is in relation to China's own experience of European imperialism. I think this is a more familiar idea now. Many people have talked about this, that BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, is China's way of coming out of the so-called century of humiliation, that period from the 1830s to the 1940s, in which China, having previously been in such a powerful position, as we heard today, again, economically, in so many ways, in the 18th century, China was still riding very high. And then it descends into the depths over the next 100 years. So BRI is China reasserting itself, asking the world as Andre Gunder Frank puts it, to reorient, to think of the East once more as a center. So in that sense, too, it's a reaction to European imperialism. Now, of course, what we might then say is, all right, it's a reaction to European imperialism, but is it a new form of Chinese imperialism? In other words, is China simply swapping one kind of empire for another? BRI is an expression of China's efforts at being a new Middle Kingdom, as Harry put it. And here I think the question is, it's a kind of historical one about what we think the Chinese experience of empire was. You know, we're used to talking about the Chinese empire, this 2,000-year period of history from the Qin and the Han setting up the Chinese empire right up to 1911. We call that the Chinese empire. I'm just curious to know what that means. I would really be interested to know what the people here who study China think they mean when they say and talk about, as many people do, the Chinese empire. What kind of an empire was it? I'm struck very much by the fact that if it was an empire, it didn't seem to be a particularly expansive empire. The kind of context in which it operated was not so much to acquire new territories, and certainly not overseas territories, but not even very much new land territories. I mean, the one exception, I suppose, was during the Qing period, when the Qing did go out and incorporate Tibet and Xinjiang and the Mongol. That's the one period in which China seems to have been expansive, in which we can perhaps truly talk about imperialism in the classic European sense. But for most of the rest of that 2,000-year history, it seems to me that China was not an empire in the way that most of the European empires were. It did not go out to conquer. It did not go out to accumulate territories. So if we do think of BRI as a new form of Chinese imperialism, perhaps we should think of it in the perspective of the way China historically was an empire, which was very different from the European form of empire. Might that make us think of BRI in a different way too? We can say, yes, it's a continuation of China's attempt to reassert its role in the world as a global power, to reorient, indeed. But does that mean the same thing as the imposition of a kind of global empire in the way that we might have thought of the British or the French trying to impose their empire on the world classically in the 19th century? So I just want us to sort of throw up in the air the various ways in which empire has been exercised in the past, and ask the question whether the Chinese empire was in some sense different, and if so, does that help us to think what China might be trying to do now with the BRI initiative? It might not be afraid of thinking of it as an empire, but it might be thinking of that empire very much in its own terms, and that would suggest a very different pattern, I think, from classic European imperialism.
Thank you. I found these comments to be very provocative and very insightful. I think I'd like to see Case sort of caution not to talk about colonialism. And I think it's possible to think of empire as being different than colonialism, to make that distinction, with colonialism being reflective of a particular historical period, an empire extending throughout history in different ways. And when I think about empires, I like to think about them in a structural way, at least in terms of finding commonalities amongst them. And so it seems to me that one of the key elements of an empire is the distinction between center and periphery. That is, empires are built in centers and they have peripheries, and the relationships between centers and peripheries, Bradley will like this, is asymmetric. All right, and but it does seem to me that in contrast to empires of earlier periods, what's distinctive about the BRI as an empire, and I think you can think about it as an empire because I do think it's creating center and periphery. you know, I think if you look at the structure, if you look at the maps, etc., the point is to link other areas with China. And we can see that in terms of the history of the BRI, which began sort of trying to develop Western China and then trying to link Western China to other areas. I think it's almost articulated in the objectives of the BRI, at least earlier on. But what is distinctive, I think, from empires of earlier eras is this empire is also associated with a form of capitalism. And to me, that means a certain dynamism. And to me, what makes it distinctive from other empires associated, from other empires is that the, if you will, extension or dynamism that's driven by capitalism is not necessarily to expand only in terms of geography, that is, including new areas, but it's also to expand in terms of technology, so that there's a, might call it a technologically intensive aspect to this empire where, it's allowing for a system of accumulation. That accumulation is not only being applied to expand geographically, but we could clearly see at some point the ends of that geographical expansion, but it's then also expanding intensively in terms of technology.
Can I just very quickly respond to that very helpful comment from John? It reminds me of the fact that even within European imperialism, there was a distinction between empire proper, where colonies were acquired and administered and ruled, and what was called informal imperialism, which was the kind of rule, for instance, the British tried to have in South America. They didn't have any colonies there, but countries like Argentina were very, very strongly controlled by English capital. So you did have that form of capital rule. The question to me always has been, and the reason why I've always been somewhat resistant to this notion of informal capital, is that the extent of direction and dictation is very, very unclear. With territorial empire, you know exactly what the situation is. You've got administrators, you've got armies, you've got force, and they exercise the right to intervene. With informal capital, informal imperialism, it's a form of persuasion. And again, I was thinking of some of the things that Qin was saying, that Chinese capital in Africa is different from global private capital because it's aiming at a certain degree of political influence. And I wonder whether you might not think that is quite close to some concept of informal empire, where you invest not necessarily simply to make profit, but you want to exercise a certain degree of political influence in the region. Is that a kind of creeping imperialism, that you gradually build up a whole series of patron-client relationships, with China having the money, being the patron, and all these client states around the world? You're not taking them over, but you're definitely going to have influence in their politics.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed this this conversation very much. Okay, listen, I think history is important and is illustrative, but whatever China did with the empire in the past, I think using that analogy to understand the current period may not be that helpful, because what is the connection between what the emperors were doing with the Communist Party leaders? They are now in Beijing. I don't think they are looking at the history book and see, oh, well, this is the way China does empire, and we now do it again. I think that's why I emphasize on the ground, which is to actually see these agents from China, what they're after, how they're doing their stuff, and then once we know empirically what they're actually doing and are able to achieve, then we can conceptualize what they're doing. So that's the first thing. History is important, but I don't think these guys that I met and the people in Beijing, they were looking at their own history book and try to copy a tier page. The playbook is the same, and we do it now. The second thing is, as I emphasize over and over again, Beijing may have a vision of empire, let's say they have, but to what extent can they achieve anything? My experience on the ground really is I see so much resistance everywhere. All the speakers today actually particularly John's presentation, and my own work, really show that there are tremendous local reaction. I think I have a slide I didn't show. Local foundation of global China is the key to understanding what global China is about. Not thinking in terms of analogy or reading into their plan, but what they can actually do. I want to be rich, but I'm not rich. I want to be a billionaire, but that's in my head. And I think the same. China may have planned, but even that, I'm not so sure. We need to talk to those people who are making policy and plans rather than just read off some document. And so I think there's a lot of groundwork, research, empirical research to be done before we can actually talk about whether empire is useful and what. But from the ground, I think there's a lot of pushback against whatever China is doing anywhere. That's why it's not an empire. If we
no, I totally agree with you, and just want to say very quickly that the cultural dimension is not to be kind of underestimated, and because in a way that many empires historically started by accident, almost like it's a kind of wish to secure more and more resources and secure borders, and then you end up in a situation where you cannot manage the empire anymore. So if you think about the Portuguese and the British or even the Romans, and they kind of seem to have followed that pattern. Maybe the Chinese is really facing the same kind of problems. This is not geopolitics. They're not seeking geopolitics, like what Professor Yan was saying. It's geopolitics seeking them. It's quite the opposite problem. Frankly.
I would like to say a word in favor of history, not because history is likely to repeat itself or that history forms a conscious model for current developments under Belt and Road Initiative, but because without considering the varieties of history, and especially the varieties of the history of the immediate participants, like China in this case, we're left with a default notion of how empires behave, which is like how the most recent empire is behaving. And that becomes the default expectation. And I think our expectations need to be broader than that. And certainly they need to be demonstrated on the basis of on the ground. But then to add to Shichao's point about culture, I think that I really enjoyed your remarks about the difference of Chinese capitalism and the difference of Chinese thinking, because it seems to me that in my experience, relationships versus transactions are key. And transactions are the key to microeconomics. Relationships seem to be much more important in Chinese culture and also in Chinese foreign policy. Relationships are much more specific to specific partners. Relationships tend to, you might say they invest resources without a specific goal in mind, but to preserve, to create certainties in the future. And when you talk about the political patronage created by state capitalism, we shouldn't think of that as, I guess the crudest form of thinking of that would still be accurate would be the Godfather, and the doing a favor for the undertaker. But other forms of thinking of that, thinking about the importance of stability of expectations in one's relationships over an unknown future. In a village or in international politics, you don't know what's going to happen in 5 years, but you know who you're going to be dealing with in 5 years. So this is a strategic logic. It's not giving up your own interest. It's considering your long-term interest in an indeterminate future to be at least as significant as your short-term gain in a transaction.
It appears to be a small difference there, but actually it produces a systemic difference. as the steps that has been translated throughout the economic system. I think that's really a key of kind of establishment of stability, of some sort of understanding. And this is really very much, I mean, when you kind of described how the Chinese state companies behaved in Zambia, this is, to me, that's exactly the kind of empirical work that demonstrate that point, that is eventually a huge difference, but originally you can kind of go back to a cultural differentiation that seems to be small. This is quite interesting.
So, sorry, it's me here. I thought I would I think the lens of empire is actually appropriate. I want you to imagine this from the perspective of, say, the African, right? In China's presence on the continent then is unremarkable, because China is just the latest of those who've come before, right? Europeans have come before, and now it's the Chinese. When China first arrived on the continent, it was mainly economic. But there is a naval outpost in Djibouti, and those would expand. There's nothing that every indication shows now. In fact, what has risen is actually Chinese private military. There's been an increase in Chinese private military deployed to provide protection along the Belt and Road, for protection for Chinese companies that are doing that work. So we're seeing that. Second thing is, China is one of the largest now suppliers, especially of small arms and light weapons, across Africa. They've actually built a military facility in Tanzania to continue with training. Across the continent, there are about 20 Confucius Institutes, right, teaching Chinese language and culture. In South Africa, in Uganda, in Kenya, we're actually beginning to instruction now in Chinese language. So if you're an African and you're looking at this relationship, having experienced the European experience, so in Africa, we speak French, English, Portuguese, and then Equatorial Guinea weirdly speaks Spanish, right? But now we're beginning to learn Chinese. If you're an African and you're filtering this experience, what is the best lens through which to describe this, now that the Chinese expense, Chinese disbursement, Chinese investment, that is not only linked to how much they make in return, but how much influence they have over the decisions one makes. An empire, we have to remember, is always constrained by the international politics as it is set up. So maybe this version of empire is constrained by the way international politics is set up now, but I think empire provides an appropriate lens through which to be able to engage what's happening with BRI.
Okay, I just wanted to ask Shichao a little bit more about how his particular understanding of Chinese capitalism, the way in which Chinese firms are different, their expectations are different. How are they selling this to the rest of the world as part of this Belt and Road Initiative? Because it seems to me that there is no language that's being used in the way that BRI is being projected in the world. If you look at the speeches of Xi Jinping, history is clearly the reference point there. I mean, he seems to be deliberately evoking a past, maybe a rather idealized, maybe a rather romanticized past, but the whole Silk Roads imagery is clearly historically orientated. So I don't see how we could possibly not. I mean, I entirely agree with you, Brantley. I don't see how we could possibly leave history out of it, because the very initiative itself is couched in historical terms without any doubt, it seems to me. We might then want to unpack that and say it's not exactly the way it was in the past and there are new features. But how are they selling BRI? You've given a kind of more attractive account of what the Chinese firm is like compared to the typical Western capitalist firm. How is that being wound into the vocabulary of BRI, the imagery that is being projected in the world?
I think it's probably
Have they even tried?
Well, maybe not as consciously. I think it has a different kind of promotional culture that does different things. I think one really important point of persuasion is that they can always argue that they have delivered goods and end of story. And like, how do they do it? They probably take 20, 100 different steps and that are not directly related to that particular results. And that's exactly the kind of economic activities, that you can find in China when you enter into a business deal and you don't really just to straight say that I want to do this, and you go out for dinner, you're going to sing, or like you talk about your children and you watch TV together and stuff like that. So there's a risk that kind of peripheral activities that are not kind of directly associated with the specificity of a goal. But that, if you imagine that kind of blown up and enlarged at an international stage, and you could begin to understand that, oh yeah, this is how it operates in an international stage, and that kind of, you begin to kind of rewrite a different kind of politics, and perhaps the older frameworks of references like empires and colonization no longer begin to be able to describe this new kinds of activity. I mean, I think at least we should keep that as like an open option in the way we speculate about future political landscape in the world. And I think cultures are different, and if you push me, and I would argue a lot more between the distinction between the Sinitic, linguistic, cultural context, cultural makeup, and the Indo-European, which has been kind of the root of the previous kind of expansive empires, if you like, and then colonization. Marshall McLuhan once said that the alphabet is militant and, what was the word, expansive. Militant and expansive. And he didn't explain what it is. That's what I understood, that it's a different kind of intellectual makeup, different cultural distinction that eventually translates through manifolds in political actions at the international stage.
I have a question here. I wonder if rather than empire and colonies, etc., we should be talking about systems of rank. China has been involved in that forever, and it seems to me what it's done is shift what it uses in order to rank itself in whatever the stage is. I watched the 2013 New Year celebration in China, and I remarked to a friend that it looked like an American variety show. And he said, well, had I been watching television during the Tang Dynasty, it all would have looked Buddhist. And his implication was that at that point in time, China was organizing itself in reference to Buddhist ideas. Yeah. Now it's doing it in reference to Western ideas. Yeah. And those involve things that look like capitalism to us. Those involve things that look like scientific development and scientific advancement. And I think Howie gave us an extraordinary illustration of China doing as well or better what various Western countries have been doing increasingly since World War II. So I think it's ranking.
No, I think that's a really great comment. Ranking is huge throughout Chinese history. All the bureaucracy is ranked in 36 different ranks in the Qing dynasty and 30 different ranks in Tang dynasty. And they're colored and they have different sizes of stuff. Like when you have lunch and you have a different set of lunch because you're ranking. So today, Chinese cities are ranked. Probably not too many people know that every city is ranked. Your ranking determines your entitlement to resources. So there's a whole kind of a material-based ranking activity that, this is just one of possible ways to understand this kind of new political landscape and getting us out of that kind of maybe by now very tired framework of colonization, colonialism, and empire. We need to be a little bit more innovative politically to think through this, and we need to take the culture seriously, really, if you want to understand what's going on. The language, the history, and so many other things. What we so habitually do too fast is to kind of apply an existing model to China and say, pronounce that this is this and this is that. This is not to excuse all the kind of, problems or, failures or, fundamental miscalculations and even the similarities. I do think that the displacement of capital is a common pattern, like the Chinese kind of capital excess and led to the expansion of the overseas operation, but it doesn't account for the fundamental political landscape that is laying out in front of us. And this is really what this kind of amazing project is pushing us to do. Dorothy is making some signs.